Welcome to today's Sunday Social. So today we're moving on from the first instalment of the Sarai or Sarah Hagar story to the section where we hear about the birth of Sarah's son Isaac and the sending away of Hagar and Ishmael. So by this time, Sarai is Sarah, and this time we're going to think more about Sarah's story and also what we learn about God here. So we're going to think about Sarah, the journey she's on, and we'll touch on Abraham a bit, and there are multiple characters that touch on this story. So when you listen to the reading, do try and think about this from each perspective. Why did they say or do what they did? And what was God's purpose in it all? So off we go.
The reading is from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5 and 8 to 20. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne to Abraham was mocking, and she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly, because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And so she sat there nearby, and she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer.
Who is like you, Lord, in all the earth? Matchless love and beauty, endless worth. Nothing in this world can satisfy. 'Cause Jesus, you're the cup that won't run dry. Your presence is heaven to me. Your presence treasure of my heart and of my soul. In my weakness you are merciful. Redeemer of my past and present wrongs, holder of my future days to come. Your presence is heaven to me. Your presence is heaven to me. Oh Jesus, oh Jesus, your presence is heaven to me. Oh Jesus, oh Jesus, your presence is heaven to me. All my days on earth I will await the moment that I see you face to face. Nothing in this world can satisfy, 'cause Jesus, you're the cup that won't run dry. Jesus, you're the cup that won't run dry. Your presence is heaven to me. Your presence is heaven to me. Your presence is heaven to me. Your presence is heaven to me.
So I started this little two-part series last week thinking about Hagar, the outsider, the one with no power over her circumstances, and yet the one that God hears when she cries out for help. So in today's reading, at the end, Hagar cries out again and is heard, and Ishmael starts a nation because he is also the offspring of Abraham. I don't want to dwell again on Hagar and Ishmael, but rather think a bit more about Sarah, a bit about Abraham, and also about what the God story is here. So back to my headings from last week. People, can't live with them, can't live without them. And God, a very real help in times of trouble. So, Sarah. Now, in Sarah's case, it would seem more appropriate to start off with men, can't live with them, can't live without them. We don't know how Sarai and Abram met. We meet them as an established couple. We're introduced to Sarai in Genesis 11, verse 29. Here she's mentioned as the wife that Abraham took while still in Ur of the Chaldees, that is, while among his kindred. It's immediately added that Sarai was barren. She had no child. So at this time, women were defined by the men around them. Whose daughter, wife, mother you are. Childlessness was a failing, and it was seen as a punishment from God. Eventually, she is blessed with a child, and he is called Isaac, which means laughter. And Abraham becomes patriarch, so Sarah also then becomes matriarch. As time goes on, the Jewish line continues to this day to follow mother to child. Interestingly, when Abram laughs at the idea that he and Sarai will have a child in their old age, he's not censured. But when Sarai does it, God says, "Why did you laugh? Don't you think I can do it?" Perhaps this is a subtly different response to a man or a woman showing incredulity in the face of God's plan. There are some very feminist readings of the story of Hagar and Sarai that are based on the patriarchy. Earlier in Genesis, Abram lets Pharaoh take Sarai as his wife, saying that she is his sister, because that is what is in his best interests, which seems very callous and self-interested. Makes you wonder how Sarai would have experienced that. He turns her over to adultery, which, when he realises, incensed Pharaoh, who seemed to have a better understanding of God's view of unfaithfulness than Abraham did at this point. Then, in between Hagar having Ishmael and Sarah herself getting pregnant, Abimelech, king of Gerar, wanted a strategic alliance with Abraham, sends for Sarah, whom he knows only as Abraham's sister, and for a second time she takes her place in the harem of a prince at Abraham's bidding. In a dream, God reveals to Abimelech who she really is, and Sarah is restored to her husband. So there is a note here. It's possible that Sarai was Abram's half-sister. So sister isn't entirely untrue, but her status as wife is the more important one here. At this point in Scripture, this sort of marriage, half-brother and half-sister, has not been explicitly forbidden. That happens in Leviticus 18. So this may have been a lie by omission rather than an outright deceit, but it still shows Abram with little regard for Sarah and her wishes, doesn't it? So for Sarah, the patriarchy was not a positive experience. So back to people in general. Sarah could possibly be described as someone who doesn't play well with others, at least from the perspective of the story with Hagar. She abused her power over Hagar. Now, not necessarily through the surrogacy, although we would see it that way now, but by her treatment of Hagar, which we know made Hagar run away. We don't know exactly what it involved, but we know that Hagar ran away from it. Hagar is sent back to Sarah, by God in the desert. Now, what message is that sending? Hagar is there with Sarai, Sarah, and Abraham for another 14 years without any crisis. Nothing appears in the Bible about them at this time, before the events of this reading that we've heard today. So Abraham becomes very fond of Ishmael, and he asks God to recognise this son as the promised son. That he's very distressed in the NIV translation to sending away Ishmael really understates the strength of this emotion. It's only when he's reassured that Ishmael will father a nation that he relents. I'm not going to dwell on Abraham here, but his conduct throughout this story is a bit dubious, to say the least. So Sarah dies at the age of 127 at Hebron. The grief and devotion of Abraham are broadly displayed in Genesis 23, in which he seeks and obtains a burying place for his wife. She's the first to be interred in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which was to be the common resting place of the fathers and mothers of the future Israel. So, in my studying of this passage, I've come across some assertions about Sarah, and I want to share them with you. And I'm going to pause before I respond to give you time to think. So think of this as interaction. If we were in person, I would be putting you on the spot and saying, "What do you think about that?" and not moving on until someone spoke. So my first assertion. On the one hand, we have seen that lapse from faith which resulted in the birth of Ishmael, and that lack of self-control and charity which resulted in a quarrel with Abraham, an act of injustice to Hagar, and the disinheriting of Ishmael. A lapse from faith. What do you think about that? I'm not convinced that there's a lack of faith here. She didn't know that she was the one who was going to bear the child. Abraham is told that he's going to be the father. But Sarai's use of Hagar at that point is not subverting the will of God. As far as she was concerned at that point, it could have been fulfilling it. Another one. Yet on the other hand, we see in Sarah, as the New Testament writers point out, one who through a long life of companionship with Abraham shared his hope in God, his faith in the promises, and his power to become God's agent for achieving what was humanly impossible. That in spite of her outbreak about Hagar and Ishmael, she was in general in subjection to her husband, and of a meek and quiet spirit, appears from her husband's genuine grief at her decease. My only issue with this assertion really is that the subjection to her husband and of a meek and quiet spirit is somehow to be commended. Now that may be personally me speaking. I think we can be clear that when Abraham is mourning her passing, there is a reflection of a loss of a companion. But I don't think subjection and meek and quiet spirit were much up for discussion at the time. I'm not sure how good of a companion she was at times anyway, because if you remember in the story, she really pushes Abram to go against his better judgment, particularly in the reading that we've had today. He didn't want to send them away. And a third thing. Wikipedia says, Sarah is a biblical matriarch and prophetess and major figure in Abrahamic religions. Fair enough. While some discrepancies exist in how she is portrayed by the different faiths, Judaism, Christianity and Islam all depict her character similarly, as that of a pious woman renowned for her hospitality and beauty, the wife and half-sister of Abraham and the mother of Isaac. Now, far be it from me to disagree with what is on the internet, but I'm not sure that this quite describes the character that I've been studying, preparing for this. It may be that if you look at a very high-level picture, Christianity depicts Sarah as a pious woman, renowned for her hospitality and beauty, the wife and half-sister of Abraham. But I think what this is telling me is we need to remember that one act doesn't define us if we're not consistent with it. Jean-Paul Sartre said in his existentialist philosophy that we cannot behave out of character, because by behaving in a certain way, that is our character. So every time we think of ourselves, perhaps we would hopefully have a fairly positive view of ourselves. Every time we want to describe ourselves in a certain way, we need to be remembering that one act that contradicts that description undermines it. So Sarah may be renowned for her hospitality, but she didn't look after Hagar very well. Just a thought. And moving on to our second heading, God, a very real help in times of trouble. So I've touched on this before. Abram already knew that he would sire the people of God, but it isn't told to Sarah that she will be the mother until later. And it makes me wonder, why didn't Abram share this with her earlier? So Abram is told in Genesis 17 verse 19 that he will be a father, but Sarah isn't told until chapter 18. Sarah feels despair that she can't have children, and when she uses Hagar, she doesn't know that isn't how it's supposed to be. God hasn't told her yet. So faithfulness to God's plan doesn't always assume that we will know what it is. Having said that, in our passage today we heard repetition of God did what he had promised. So once he had promised it, he followed it through. Against all odds, Sarah does have a child. So back to the idea of Sarah and faithfulness. Paul and others in the New Testament often refer to Abraham as an example of faithfulness, but Sarah was just as faithful as him. For example, when God called Abram to be nomadic, Sarai had to follow. Sarai basically got the short end of the stick in the whole Abraham covenant, but she followed it through and she carried on. I think we can tell from this that there are elements about the story. If you read this reading, you can pick up on different bits. I don't know about you, but I often will read a passage and focus on particular words or phrases. Now, I'm sure that in the words and phrases I've missed out, there are whole sermons I could have preached on this reading. But I am firmly of the belief that if I talk for longer than you can concentrate, I am wasting my time and yours. The Bible is incredibly nuanced, and I hope that this has encouraged you to think more deeply about characters that we see in the stories that we read, even the stories that we think we know. Maybe look at things in a couple of different translations. That's something I've really picked up in looking at this, how often the word in English is questionable. Now, it wouldn't feel right to cover this passage without noting that God could have made this whole process an awful lot easier. He could have told Sarai that she was the one who was going to have the baby. He could have given her the baby sooner. If he didn't do that, he could have given Sarah and Abraham a talking to so that they didn't treat Hagar so badly. There are always all sorts of what-ifs, aren't there? I guess we need to remember that sometimes we see only dimly the purpose of God, and that humankind chose not to accept a world where God was truly in control. And as we heard last week, that was obviously all Eve's fault. So I don't believe that God sends us horrible experiences to teach us lessons, but I do believe that we can learn from them nonetheless. If we learn anything from the overall narrative of Sarah and Hagar, it's that we can all be the outsider sometimes, and that it's all the more reason to treat the outsider well. We can also learn that God hears us when we cry out to him, even if we don't see the response that we want or expect. So next week we'll be looking at the story of the Canaanite woman. You'll find this in Matthew 15, 21 to 28. I hope this has given you some food for thought. See you again next week. Peace be with you.
His face shine upon you and be gracious
forever.